Welcome everyone. I'm Anupriya Das Singh and I am the Senior Manager of the Healing Team at Arpan. We are one of the largest NGOs in India working to address the issue of child sexual abuse in India through our prevention and intervention programs. Over the last 14 years, we have reached out to more than 290,000 children, adolescents and adults directly and over a million through training and capacity building of various stakeholders. When the child goes through sexual abuse, often the family experiences so much guilt and shame or is in denial that many times children are not supported and therapeutic support is not sought for the child as well as for the caretakers. More often than not, the child and their need to heal is forgotten and that takes a backseat. However, what they need most is the holistic healing so that when they grow up, they are not anymore battling with disturbing memories of past trauma or surviving the abuse, but thriving. In this forum, we'll try to explore the idea of holistic healing with the help of our esteemed panelists. Let me introduce our panelists to you. Sonal Kapoor is the founder director at NGO Protsahan, an organization that works critically on child protection from a psychosocial lens and encouraging young adults from difficult backgrounds to reach their full potential with access to education, health, and gender justice. She is a World Bank Fellow, Vital Voices Lead Fellow, Australia India Fellow, Youth Fellow, and an alumni of Indian School of Business. She has pursued child protection law from National Law School of India University and Harvard University. She advises with UNICEF India and Save the Children on critical child care projects. Welcome, Sonal. So good to see you. Havovi is a psychologist and a psychotherapist with a private practice at Manashini at Powai, Mumbai. Since 2010, she is working specifically with complex trauma, anxiety disorders, and personality disorders. She has presented papers and posters on trauma intervention at national and international conferences. She has also trained group of students, mental health professionals, and healthcare workers on trauma counseling. She writes to raise awareness on mental health through her blog and through print and online media. She has also initiated EMDR supervision groups for clinical practitioners with consultants from US and Europe. She is currently pursuing her PhD in the field of secondary traumatic stress from TISS, Mumbai. She has received 2 awards from Young Environmentalist Foundation and Science Healthcare. So good to see you, Havovi. Welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Our last panelist is Namrata from Arpan. Namrata Joshi is an Assistant Manager Healing Services at Arpan. She holds a master's degree in clinical psychology and is trained in therapies like REBT, EMDR, art-based therapy. Helping others heal is one of her core strengths and she effectively uses her innate skills with learned techniques to provide trauma relief. Passionately, she has been working for the last 5 years with Arpan and has helped hundreds of children smile again. Welcome, Namrata. Okay. So before we move on to our questions, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mrs. Neerja Birla, and a supporter of our Arpan's work, a passionate educationist and a mental health champion. Mrs. Neerja Birla is the founder and chairperson of Aditya Birla Education Trust and has established the Aditya Birla World Academy, Aditya Birla Integrated School, Aditya Birla Education Academy, and Empower, a pioneering mental health initiative. An inspiring personality, Mrs. Birla is a progressive, dynamic, and versatile woman. Driven by her passions and an unwavering resolve to give back to the society with a sense of responsibility. She is also a committed fitness and outdoor sports enthusiast, loves reading and listening to music, and is extremely fond of traveling and trekking. She couldn't join us at the webinar, but has sent her message through the video. So we'll just play a small video now.
Hello everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Pooja Tapadia and Arpan for inviting me to this webinar and giving me this opportunity to extend my solidarity to Child Safety Week. Together, we must amplify the conversations on child sexual abuse and the steps that we can take to stop the perpetrators and help the survivors heal. The words child sex abuse send a chill down my back. I'm sure the pain it triggers in all of us really cuts us deep. The trauma can leave a deep and lifelong impact on the mental health of the sufferers. As we all know, child sexual abuse is a serious and widespread problem in India, and the statistics paint an extremely scary picture. In 2018, 39,827 cases were registered under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. One shudders to even think about the number of cases that go unreported. The sad truth is that in 90% of the reported cases, the offenders are known to the victims. In 10% of the cases, the abusers are family members themselves. India is a country where the reprehensible practice of child labor is still active illegally. 25% of the rapes of children in 2015 were committed by their employers or co-workers. These facts are by themselves a wake-up call for all of us to do something about. Child sexual abuse is a complex issue with long-lasting psychological sequelae on the victims. The after effects differ from case to case depending on the circumstances. Even when one talks to two victims abused by the same person, different emotional and psychological reactions manifest themselves. Many children are way too young to fully understand what has happened to them. However, the feeling of being violated is always there. So many victims choose to suffer in silence or are forced to keep quiet about it because of the stigma. It's important for all of us, parents and everyone in society, to be vigilant for signs and red flags of sexual abuse amongst children. Some of them could be like sudden behavioral changes, or withdrawal from family and friends, or difficulty in sleeping, regular nightmares, or even regressive behavior like bedwetting, sudden decline in academic performance, or disciplinary issues at school. Even if they start displaying sexually inappropriate behavior, talking or behaving in a manner that is unsuitable to their age. Many victims feel uncomfortable when they recount their experience, so to make them feel comfortable is extremely crucial. We must allay the child's fears and get them to open up and not to withdraw into a shell. At no point should parents consider the issue taboo and just try to sweep it under the carpet. In fact, this is the time when the child needs all the help and support. If you come across a case of sexual abuse, report it. It is also our duty as a society to make sure that the abuser is held accountable. Most importantly, seeking timely professional help is critical. If the healing happens early enough, a long-term negative impact can be avoided. At Empower, we've learned that healing is a process in itself and each victim's recovery path needs to be personalized. Hence, our process of counseling and therapy differ from client to client. The first step is always to ensure that the victim feels safe. Then various clinical practices and therapies like narrative therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, art-based therapy, etc. in different combinations have shown positive results. The Empower Foundation works with rescued girls at the NGO Asha Sadan. Many of these girls are victims of sexual abuse, in many cases by family members themselves. Besides dealing with the trauma, many of the girls feel guilty and responsible for this situation. Unable to process the negative emotions, self-harm is a serious worry with them. Thankfully, right interventions facilitated the healing process and has helped many of the girls overcome their mental health issues. We're also working with a 6-year-old boy who was sexually abused at a school by a group of construction workers. After the incident, he refused to go to school, displayed clingy behavior and aggression in the form of biting and scratching. He started developing and having nightmares and voicing suicidal thoughts. We also have the case of an adult female who's been sexually abused as a child. Her trauma had manifested into severe anxiety and depression. She also had issues sustaining a romantic relationship. During therapy, she revealed that she still harbors a sense of guilt and shame about her ordeal. Her belief was that somehow she was responsible for the abuse and just not worthy of happiness. After 3 years of therapy, however, now she is coping much better. Another client is a member of the LGBTQ community. A victim of sexual abuse as a child, he is now showing signs of bipolar. He's been unable to maintain relationships of any kind, not with his parents and not socially either. He's never satisfied with the job opportunities he gets, and he's now become prone to compulsive lying. The progress with him is slow, but it's steady. So many people have been sexually abused as children but never received help for it. For others, the trauma kicks in when they reach adolescence and understand what has really happened. With time, survivors of childhood sexual abuse often begin to believe that it's better for them to not think about this horrible incident. They think it helps them avoid the debilitating feelings and function normally. But repressing memories can affect mental health adversely. Triggers may bring the emotional issues to the fore, which is why it is also essential for adult survivors to seek therapy. They deserve to break the shackles of the past and live happy and dignified lives. Their stories can also inspire others to come forward. In conclusion, I firmly believe it is our collective responsibility to bring this human horror to light. We must bring enough awareness to stop the perpetrators while supporting the victims to heal. We have to create a safe environment for them. We have to help them and rehabilitate them. We have to help them look forward to their future. Thank you.
At Arpan, we have always believed in holistic approach, which we understand as using different therapeutic modalities which are client-centric. My question to you, Havovi, I would like to understand from you, how do you deal with cases of child sexual abuse? What kind of therapeutic approaches do you use?
So hi Namrita and Anupriya
Hi.
and all the and Sonal of course. And thank you for having me here. Thanks for organizing this event on such an important topic. So I'm primarily, as a practitioner, I work with the therapeutic modalities of cognitive behavior therapy and EMDR. And when it comes to the domain of trauma, then EMDR, as we know, is the frontline therapy. So I choose to use that. I'll just explain a little bit about EMDR just to initiate people into understanding it. So it's the full form of EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was a therapy that was discovered by chance and by its founder, Dr. Francine Shapiro. And it was earlier thought to be a form of an exposure therapy. That is, the person would be exposed to the traumatic memory, and through the process of that exposure, it would stop impacting them. But with EMDR, we use something called as eye movements, where the therapist tends to move their finger across the visual field of the client. And we know that the bilateral stimulation of both hemispheres of the brain tend to bring about not just a desensitization, but a kind of a reprocessing. So should I be louder? A bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So the process of working with that traumatic experience through EMDR brings about not just a desensitizing, but helps the person have a new way of looking at the event altogether. So they not just have a reduction in the symptoms, the anxiety and the associated emotions, but they also have a more positive and a healthier way of looking at themselves. Their cognitions change. And we know that it's a treatment that works pretty rapidly, much more rapidly than other forms of therapy, especially with regard to trauma and stress or traumatic stress, the whole domain. So having viewed personally its impact and also having presented papers on it and taken so many hours of training with it, I understand that when there are cases of sexual abuse particularly, then it would be my preferred form of therapeutic modality. So just to answer your question, what do I do specifically with cases of child sexual abuse? They can reach my clinic in either of two ways, as would happen, I think, with a lot of people. Either it comes in as primary trauma, that is the parents
Hmm.
or the guardians or caretakers know that the child has gone through sexual abuse, and that's the primary presenting complaint. But I would say that in private practice, those cases reach me much fewer. A larger probability is of cases of child sexual abuse coming to me wrapped up or coated in a different symptom modality. So the child may present with academic difficulty, concentration problems, sometimes acting out behavior. And then when I'm, getting into the history and I have developed a rapport with the child, then incidents of sexual abuse emerge, which, as we all know, comes as no surprise, usually will happen by somebody in the home environment, either somebody who's a caretaker, family member, even a parent. Now, in the first case, because people know about the abuse, establishing safety becomes a little easier. In the second case, I find it a lot more challenging, especially as a private practitioner. So I
Hmm.
enlist the help of, say, a local physician, a gynecologist, if it's a child who is of a puberty age, sometimes with the family doctor of that particular family, enlist the help to break the news as well as to get the child examined. And then there are issues sometimes around reporting, which we know is a controversial issue. And I always seek the support of the family in making that decision. But let's say there is absolutely no information about the sexual abuse that the family had, then the first thing is to get the family on board, help them understand, get the child into a safer environment if possible, move the perpetrator out of the home if that is even possible. So a lot of time is first spent around establishing that safety. Um, if and when the safety does get established, which I can tell you is also a big challenge, then we move to working with the child's emotions and the actual memory. Again, cases never are so straightforward with just an incident reported of sexual abuse. Obviously, if there is sexual abuse reported in the home environment or in the child's environment, there is some form of neglect that the child would have faced as well, and not enough preparation to cope with these things. So the situations will sometimes be more complex. The child will require a lot more support in preparation, in understanding their emotions and having language for them. So in EMDR, we follow an 8 phase protocol. We have the first phase, which is history taking, moving to the second phase, where we prepare the child or prepare the individual to face the traumatic memories, which happens in the third phase between phases 3 and 7. So, in phase 2 with a child, I will typically use a lot of some forms of art therapy, um, play therapy. I will also use a lot of child friendly material like books that are written specifically to explain trauma and EMDR to the child, picture books, story books, play figures, sand tray, all of those things that will help the child sort of get a healthier understanding of themselves, their emotions, and they won't get scared and afraid when we approach that traumatic experience. So with EMDR, we always work at the pace of the client, what the client wants. So if the child is not is in a place where they cannot, for example, know what's happening in their body, or they don't know how to name an emotion, or they have difficulty trusting someone in their environment, then a lot of that has to be built in first. Typically, if that goes well and we have a very robust preparation phase, then we can move to targeting those trauma memories. And in EMDR, we work in several ways. So we can either directly target the memory that the child has come with, or there may be antecedent events of abuse or neglect before the sexual abuse happened that the child may want to work with, or which seem to be more disturbing. Then we work with those. But typically, if we are taking up a memory of, say, abuse, then we work with the worst part of it, an image that represents the worst part of it, a negative belief the child has around that experience, which usually for survivors of sexual abuse would be I'm not safe, or I'm helpless, or I'm powerless, or I can't trust. And then we begin the work with the eye movements. Sometimes with children, instead of eye movements, I would use other forms of bilateral stimulation, which go like tapping. Sometimes there are buzzies, which help the child. They're like small, you can say, touch-based sensitizing triggers, and the child then learns how to be able to get used to those buzzies, and we use things which are more child-friendly for the bilateral stimulation. Typically, children process memories very quickly. The bad part is that they have had to go through something so awful and so horrible. But the good part is that because of their age and their resilience, they deal much faster with events than you'll see with adults. So almost you can say
Hmm.
like magic, you'll find that they work through the memories of abuse. They rapidly start feeling better. Anupriya, when I began first working with kids and with EMDR, of course, I worked with kids
Hmm.
before I learned EMDR. I was
Hmm.
taken aback with the rapid rate at which I saw recovery in kids. Really, it would happen so fast. I would think something's going wrong here. I don't think either I'm doing a good job or this I'm not applying EMDR properly. But as I took consultation, supervision, and I attended conferences, etc., I realized that children process quickly because they don't have that many memory networks. So the more disturbed memory networks do get healed faster, and then you see a lot of rapid recovery happen. Their healing is so beautiful to watch. Children who were scared to go out of the home, they are willing to leave the home and go make new friends. Their trust and faith in the world gets re-established. Their concentration improves. Children who have nightmares of bedwetting, those symptoms start getting better. They basically go back to a healthier mode of functioning
Wow.
that they came had before the incident happened. But in some unfortunate cases, if they have had prolonged exposure to abuse incidents, way more than the healthier environment support, then we have to work a little harder to provide that environmental support and get the child to have better, healthier cognitions of themselves. But typically, I would say that children are wonderful to work with, and a modality like EMDR along with children, I think, has some really fantastic results. So it's very gratifying to see that. So that has been my experience
Beautiful.
working so far with them.
So beautiful. Thank you so much for the response. What I gather here is from Havovi's answer is trauma can, the child sexual abuse can come in layers and can be hidden. And when a practitioner starts with the process, it can actually show symptoms very different from what we expect. Another thing that I gather very clearly is EMDR works very well with children and other forms of trauma. So beautiful. Thank you so much. My next question is to Sonal. Sonal, Protsahan has worked with a lot of girls in varied spectrums. I would like to understand from you, how frequently do you encounter child sexual abuse cases, and what are the approaches you use to support them?
Thank you, Anupriya. So I think this is very valid that you asked me this, because a lot of people have this misconception that Protsahan solely works on CSA, which is not the case. So when we started working, it was we started with rescuing one girl, one 8-year-old from a brothel. But eventually, when we started working with the girls in the slums, or the girls from extremely dark places, ghettos, areas that could, so they were not like regularized slums, but they were just the street, really dark places on the street, etc. We realized that about 25 to 28% of the children that we ended up working with, they had experienced some sort of sexual abuse. So when I'm saying some sort of sexual
Okay.
abuse, I'm very responsibly saying that there were cases of incest, again, which is we've seen in a COVID world, where migration is happening, the families are more at home, the aggression, the financial constraints are on a high. We have seen the incest cases go up during the COVID phase. But even before that, we realized that about
Hmm.
25 to 28% of the cases of the children that we were working with, and this is girls, boys together, for that matter, out of the total, 25 to 28% had undergone sexual abuse, and out of that 28 odd percent, 10% were incest cases, which I think Havovi also mentioned that more than 90% times when you're talking about sexual abuse, it's somebody within the family or somebody within the known circle of people who's done it. So that was the first insight or learning that we had over a period of time. In the last 11 years odd of our work, we've also realized that a lot of child brides, a lot of child marriage cases that have come up. So in the COVID phase, we have seen incest and child marriages to be the top two reasons, in our areas of 39 to 40, 43 slums that we work in. These two being the core areas of the two core child right violations, if I talk about that we have seen. But again, what is it that works, with the girls or with the survivors, etc. And this is something that also came up as an insight, Anupriya, that a lot of times when you're working with survivors or at risk bachas, we have to look at it from a very three pronged approach that we have now sort of kind of classified also at Protsahan, and we continue to document it. One is, of course, empathy. There has to be an empathetic caregiver who will be invested in the child. Sometimes you will be surprised to find, or maybe now not surprised to find, that the families are not the first caregivers that end up on the healing journey of the child. Sometimes it's it's really like a clinical psychologist like Havovi, or like an exceptional teacher at school, or just the fact that we expect that the family or the mother or the father or the bhaiya or a didi or somebody within the family will be the first care giver to on the healing journey is a misconception. Sometimes it can be somebody absolutely non-blood related, and this empathy is the first set, or is the first way in which because जब एक बच्चे का शोषण होता है और या sexually वो violate होता है, the first thing that the child loses is a sense of trust, right? The kind of fear sometimes that the child picks up kind of translates into grief, and vice versa. A lot of times people say that fear is a different feeling, grief is a different feeling, right? Or or different feelings when we talk about emotions, when we talk about. But when a child is violated, and this is, again, I say that very responsibly, that we are not talking about only the child sexual abuse survivors. So our core area of work involves child sexual abuse, child trafficking, and child marriages, right? Fighting all of that. And we have seen that child marriage is nothing but child sexual abuse, if you look at it, right? For a
Very much.
for a 14-year-old, for a 13-year-old who ends up getting married and having a child by the time she's 15, if it's not CSA, then what is it, right? When you're looking at child trafficking, if not always for sexual reasons, etc., more than 45% of the times in our ground field practitioner basis experience, we have seen that more than 45 to 46% times child trafficking ends up in, again, sexual violations of the girl or the child that it's ended up with. So jab tak empathy or empathetic caregiver nahi hoga, the journey to healing cannot begin, right? Because this empathetic caregiver will help establish the sense of trust, will help establish a sense of routine, regulation, emotional regulation in that child. The second core principle of insight that we have seen in our work with survivors of different kinds of abuses, and specifically CSA survivors, is that a lot of creativity, which again Havovi spoke about, using art-based therapy. But again, we have to tread on this with a lot of caution, right, Anupriya? And I'm sure you've seen it in your scope of work as well at Arpan, that a lot of times people confuse art-based therapy with art as therapy. They are two different things, right? Just because somebody knows how to do a Madhubani or a paintbrush strokes, they will be art-based therapists by default. That's a misnomer. And we need the easier, the earlier we try and understand that, it's going to be better for us as practitioners in the field, right? Because I remember even in when the Delhi violence had happened, right, in February earlier this year, a lot of times there was a lot of the kids had gone through crazy amount of trauma. That was another kind of trauma, right? And so we had practitioners, etc., in the camps that were set up, and volunteers with good intentions, volunteers with the hearts in the right place, right? But when they come and say, hey, let's do art based therapy with these children because they've undergone trauma, because it sounds like a sexy thing because we're doing arts based therapy. I think there is nothing bigger violation of this entire practice in that scope of work. Because I remember there was somebody coming up and saying, अच्छा तो आपने वो आग जलते हुए देखी, आपने वो पूरा पूरा वो जो जलने का सीन था वो देखा, वो फटे हुए सिलेंडर देखे, अब उसको कला के माध्यम से पेपर पे ड्रॉ करके बताओ. And when the child drew all of that, there was no closure to this entire process, right? And the crazy amount of art that the children had put on paper, the next day it appeared in some mainline newspaper, right, saying that, oh, art-based therapy is helping the kids deal with the trauma. There was no closure that happened. There was no regulation of understand, making the child understand what she went through, that it was not her fault, that her understanding of the entire trauma was something that the therapist or even the volunteer for that matter believed in. These are some manifestations of how we are working with the child, have to constantly be hammered onto the child that all that happened that day, then irrespective of the trauma that the child has faced, that it was not your fault, right? So empathy, creativity used right, and the third core principle again being that of intersectionality, which again I think Havovi spoke about the complexity, right, with which each of these cases are. And literally one of the reasons, like when we talk about intersectionality, Anupriya, is also that a lot of people feel that एक तो हमारे सेक्टर में scale की बात इतनी होती है that we feel, oh, unless we have worked with 5 lakh children, nothing is important. And I think that's again a conversation that has to be changed, because how do you define scale? Is scale like you do a half an hour training with 5 lakh kids and you say, hey, we've reached out to, or we've impacted 5 lakh kids? Of course that's important because you've explained the difference between a safe and an unsafe touch, etc. But I mean, what about those, for example, people who are working like Havovi? Again, I will take her example, right? Let's say she works in an entire year with 15 survivors and does deep work, right? 15 people or 15 survivors versus 5 lakh children. Can we say this work is any less important? No, this is depth of scale, and that is the number line on scale, and both are critical. One does not have to be without the other, but with the other, together has to be looked at when you're specifically looking at the healing aspect, because healing will be customized, healing will be at depth. Of course there will be a pattern, and there are insights that we are now beginning to document, but these two approaches have to be looked at differently.
That's pretty enlightening. What I hear from you, Sonal, is one thing very important, that marginalized population, vulnerable population has higher risk of child sexual abuse, which you narrated by the statistics that you have observed. Another thing that I see very clearly is if there is a good support system, there is an empathetic support system, healing can become much faster, which we have also noticed. Arpan has worked with around 7,000 cases of children who faced abuse, inappropriate behavior, or unsafe situations. We have also involved families and other caregivers and enabled them as a support system, and that has facilitated healing for the child to a great extent. So completely resonate with you. My next question is with Namrata. Namrata, would you like to shed some light on how we at Arpan use holistic approach?
Thank you for the question, Anupriya. And just like how Havovi and Sonal have spoken about the importance of having a caregiver as a support system in the journey of the child, I'm going to echo something very similar. At Arpan, we follow eclectic approach, which means that we use different therapeutic modalities, but the child's well-being is something that is kept at focus. So while we work on ensuring the safety of the child, a lot of importance is also given to resolve the impact of the trauma incident that has been there with the child. So we do that with a lot of educative materials for the children. For example, giving them personal safety messages, something that Sonal spoke about, that saying them that it's not their fault that the abuse has happened, Along with that, giving them knowledge about what are child rights, what does the law say about, the child safety, how important it is. Along with that, of course, using various therapeutic modalities in order to resolve the impact further. In the whole journey, I think we also work with critically the stakeholders of the children. So this could be the primary people who are involved in child's life, or the people whom the child identifies as a trusted adult. Just like they said that most of the times, or in a lot of cases, it's not the family member or the primary caregiver who the child recognizes as a trusted adult. So any person who is there in the child's lens as somebody whom he or she can trust, having that empathetic approach from them is of major importance, um, and therefore educating them on what child sexual abuse is, how can one handle a disclosure, what can one do when the child is feeling overwhelmed or is feeling triggered. So giving these resources to those stakeholders becomes very important, and Arpan definitely recognizes the importance of this, and therefore in all the cases of child sexual abuse we ensure that we work with trusted adults of these children and take them along with the child in the journey of healing altogether. Now, as we know that trauma leaves a long lasting impact on the child if it remains unresolved. One of the areas that gets impacted is of communication and expression. Knowing that children will have very limited vocabulary to even describe what has happened or describe their feelings altogether of what they are feeling, use of lot of indirect measures like arts-based therapy, like storytelling, use of metaphors is something that we do extensively here in Arpan, so as to establish a relationship with the child and develop this healing process even further. To give you an example, for example, if I have to have a child imagine a space which is a happier space, I would do it with a lot of sensory involvement. So I may have to tell the child to close his eyes, imagine a space which is a happier space. And as he is imagining that, having him draw that or paint that is something that will help him to register this as a safe memory for himself. So at Arpan, we use a lot of these modalities to take forward the therapeutic journey.
Beautiful. Thank you, Namrata. Namrata, you have also worked in institutions and extensively worked with the girls who have gone through trauma and child sexual abuse. Can you share how you use art-based therapy with the girls in their healing journey?
That's a lovely question. I'm so glad. I think Sonal also spoke about the misconception of arts-based therapy. I think I'll go on answering the first question from there. Arts-based therapy, majorly misconceived because of its name, because when we hear about it, we only say it is to do something with colors. But in reality, it is an evidence-based therapy, and it has three different modalities, which is first being drama which involves the use of body movement in a lot of ways, use of storytelling and establishing story circles. Then there is music, that means in introducing rhythms as a form of therapy. And the last one is the visual art. Visual art is basically use of drawing, painting, and storytelling all together in the journey of the therapeutic relationship. Now, these different modalities are used keeping in mind the nature of therapeutic work. So, for example, to attain a specific therapeutic goal, if I feel that this client is more inclined towards the visual aspect of the inclination is more usual, then I would go for using colors and all of that. Yeah. At Urban, when we were involved in working with institutions, we had a different therapeutic model altogether there. The focus was majorly on group sessions because it housed girls which were almost 24 to 25 girls in one house. And like we've already mentioned here that we feel that anybody in the child environment also needs to be involved in the therapeutic process. So we used to work with the teachers and the caretakers of that given home as well. I'm just going to go into the detail of the group therapy sessions that we used to take in the house. Taking a lead from Sonal, where she mentioned that in one of the examples she quoted that there was no closure. When the work of therapy was done, there was no closure. So arts-based therapy has a specific structure in which the therapy has to start with a ritual which will help the child establish in his mind that the therapy has started. So, for example, in the home, we had a ritual of everybody closing their eyes, imagining a knob in their head, and imagining the texture, the color of it, and then opening that knob. Yeah? In one of the sessions, we observed that with trauma survivors, basically developing a sense of safety is of utmost priority. And in these homes, the girls used to come from outside and they would not feel the sense of safety very well because it's an alien space. There are other girls who are having complex trauma. Establishing relationship with them would be troublesome and everything. So in order to develop groups cohesion and a sense of safety, we developed a story circle where a therapist along with the girls in the group took or embodied the characteristics of aquatic animals, for example. So we created a sense of being in an ocean where there are few animals, aquatic animals would come very new in this ocean. So they were able to project and understand what would one feel when somebody is new in the ocean, how secluded that would be, or how unsure about one's safety would that create in one person, you know. So this helped in developing empathy. Along with that, it helped in connecting them on what is the common ground where they feel safe. You know, through these sessions, once we found out that the girls commonly felt safe when they shared lunch with each other. That's where the sense of belongingness was coming across, you know. So we highlighted that, and then providing a closure to this session, and then taking the journey ahead in the real life, so to say. So this is where basically arts-based therapy is defined, and this is the way we've used it in the institutional setup here in our.
So beautiful. So, through these discussions, it seems pretty clear that a holistic approach actually facilitates social, mental, and emotional well being. My question to you, Sonal, now is how do you see different stakeholders coming together and designing different pathways for survivors beyond a traditional route? What do you think would work best with the survivor?
Again, I'm very glad. I think the set of questions is very, very beautifully curated, Anupriya, because you know the moment we talk about any sort of child abuse, right? Not just CSA, but any sort of abuse that the child is going through, we have to look at it from a perspective of not just the child. Of course, the child has to be at the center of all the interventions that we design, and most of the times it has to be customized, contrary to the other belief that it's an approach that can be tuck tuck tuck, you know, be kind of all, you know, one size fits all approach. वो नहीं होना चाहिए. But when you're talking about different stakeholders, you know, who will impact the child in different setups. So for example, when we talk about the heart approach that we work with, so just to add on to what Namrata said very beautifully, I think, so how at Protsahan we define the way in, you know, working with different stakeholders is, and the child for that matter, is the heart approach, where heart, HEART, is an acronym where we say H is for holistic healing, E is for education because that's non-negotiable, A is for art based life skills, art or creativity based life skills, because here we are defining art not just with painting and colors, but art exactly like what Namrata explained. Art can be, performing arts, art can be dance, drama, stories, like literally, photography, filmmaking. We use a lot of those art forms. In fact, we work with the girls so deeply and for so long a gestation. Some of the girls that we work with, that they had actually ended up becoming filmmakers and wedding film photographers. So we didn't imagine that they will pick up this as a vocation, but sometimes the very pathway that we design for a child, you know um, in terms of which volunteers should the child work with, which art based form that the child should work with, that heals the child so beautifully, that the child feels a sense of purpose attached with that particular form of art, that she picks it up as a vocation, or like she ends up earning more than the brother and the father of her family combined. So that's another sort of empowerment that's happening for her at a lot of different levels, right? From a point where her sense of self-worth was gone, right? Her sense of self-love was gone when somebody violated her, or in under different contexts of trauma, which is caused by different kinds of child abuse, to a point where she's now holding a camera, she's now calling the shots, or she's at a drama stage, she's doing theater, she's transforming not just the community or other people at large, but her own self. And that is the core of the heart approach, which we use also with judges, in training members of the CWCs or the JJBs for that matter, training educators, training parents, because somewhere we realized that if you have to work with the child, or if you have to create sort of a this reconstruct the narrative, as we say, you have to work with people beyond the children, right? So for example, when a rape case happens, or a child rape happens, or a rape of a minor, as we say, happens, how does the media report it? 16 साल की लड़की के साथ some they report it as if the victim or the survivor centric headline. You never say, and you never put the pictures of even if they are accused, right? Fine, don't put the pictures, but can we say, why is it always the victim centric headline, right? So we have worked with a lot of wonderful journalists who just didn't know better, right? Because the media houses, so that's another kind of stakeholder. You cannot say that, hey, if we are working with children for addressing traumas, etc., you know um, we cannot be looking at anybody other than the children. I think that's going to be like an incomplete approach, right? So when you're talking about different sorts of reaching out to different people, it has to be looked at holistically, using the heart approach. So I was talking about HEART, H for holistic healing, E for education, because that's a non-negotiable. क्योंकि सबसे पहले education will bring in the routine and the regulation for the child, because we are also working with extremely marginalized children जिनके लिए education is a luxury, or beyond. It's not like so we, from that luxury point, we try to make it a non-negotiable in that child's life, right? A say art based, creativity based life skills, R say recovery from trauma, and T say technology based trainings. So when we say recovery from trauma, it's also not just the psychological first aid that we are giving. It's a lot of how to handle disclosures. A lot of people working with children, they feel that disclosure should happen when they are ready. That doesn't happen, right? Disclosures are not like an event. Disclosures are a process. It's a long. Sometimes disclosures can happen in one conversation, right? Sometimes healing can happen in one conversation, right? But most of the other times, disclosures and healing is a long term process, right? Which needs more investment, which needs more, people, more philanthropies and donors and CSRs, and get what you may, but them to invest in this long term process rather than expecting it to be short term and whatever. So when you're talking stakeholders also mean these probable investees in this entire process work that we do, because process work is a long term investment, when you're working with children, specifically from marginalized backgrounds. Because correct me, Habobi, if I'm wrong here, because whenever we call a child to a therapy, let's say, to a clinic based settings, a lot of times we say, a family based caregiver or a parent, etc., has to accompany the child. There are certain days of the week where we say, every Thursday from this particular time will be your time with the counselor, or XYZ. but how many times do we expect एक बच्चा जिसके मम्मी पापा की दिहाड़ी 250 रुपए की तनख्वाह है, वो आके वो कभी, एक तो वो अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकता है थेरेपी, दूसरा उसकी समझ से परे है, बिकॉज उसके लिए फिजिकल चोट चोट है, फिजिकल हर्ट हर्ट है, बट मेंटल हर्ट या जहाँ पे उसने एक ट्रॉमा अब्जॉर्ब किया है, या किसी भी तरीके का ट्रॉमा, अगेन यू नो बियॉन्ड CSA दैट आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट, उसके कॉन्टेक्स्ट, उसकी लिव्ड रियलिटीज के स्कोप में वो एक प्रॉब्लम पॉइंट नहीं है उसके पेरेंट्स के लिए, बिकॉज वो चोट टैंजिबल नहीं है, राइट? जब आपको ऐसे सारे स्टेक होल्डर्स जो कि डिफरेंट लिव्ड रियलिटीज के साथ आ रहे हैं, उनके साथ काम भी डिफरेंट तरीके से करना होगा, राइट? So for example, when we are working with educators or teachers in government schools or in different, private schools for that matter, we are very certain how we tell them to create a trauma informed compassionate care classroom, right? When we are working with judges, चाहे वो मैजिस्ट्रेट जजेस हो, चाहे वो JJB के जुडिशियल मेंबर्स हो, we always say, okay, how do you create a trauma informed compassionate courtroom, right? When you're working with parents, how do you create a trauma informed compassionate home setup, right? And now it's only after 11 years, Anupriya, that we have now begun to understand, and we are now documenting it all together. When we say holistic healing, it also to some extent needs to be codified. Again, I'm again saying that with a lot of caution, because I do understand healing is completely non-linear, like as a process. You 10 people you put together, and sabka healing journeys will be different, right? Even if they are coming on to having a similar pattern, some things will click and work, which could be codified for the larger use, but it will be completely non-linear journey, and different stakeholders have to understand that in their contexts.
So profound. So what I hear is different stakeholders would need different customization of approach to desensitize them, to help them see the bigger picture through their own lens, so that all the stakeholders come together for the same objective, and it would make healing possible. Okay, so beautiful. My question to you, Havovi now. Sometimes adult survivors who have been coping more or less well with their lives, they tend to feel that they don't need therapy. Would you support that view of theirs, or do you feel therapy may help them too?
So, firstly, Sonal has brought up so many important points, and I was just thinking that many of the adult survivors I see today, if there was an atmosphere of little more compassion, things would be so different. They wouldn't have to defend themselves so strongly in their adult life, not seek help, or believe like the sexual abuse is in the past. Often it's never in the past, it is usually present and it needs help. Of course, to answer your question, in my mind, I'm always divided. As a therapist, should I tell the adult survivor that, a sexual abuse and trauma like that, you can't just blink your eyes and say it's gone. It has these insidious impacts into your life. And if it happened at a very young age, then these insidious impacts may not be just around your sexual life. They are in many other areas that it finally, uh, you know, gets its tentacles into. So, but as a therapist, my job is not to tell the client what to do, especially an adult client, but to start from where they are. What I do and my job is to educate them. Because if I'm not doing that, then I'm not doing my job well. So I would tell them, for example, that explain to them the way memory networks work. That is, things in the present, we know the pathologies, the issues of the present often have some link to conditioned learning of the past. And what are all those issues in the past that were difficulties for you? Obviously, those will have some impact on your present life. So to educate them on that, um, and then to leave it up to them, to their choice. I can say though that 80% of the people I would see in my clinic who have had histories of child sexual abuse come to me saying that they are over it, that happened in the past, and that they are over it. Yeah. But what I have also learned, and in the early part of my career, I made a lot of mistakes. right? Because I wanted to help. So I would say, no, 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 that's not how it works. But I have learned that we have to trust our brain, and our brain holds the material, and it will automatically go to those, uh, I would say, unhealed areas and start to work with them. So I just begin where the client is at the present moment. Maybe they have, their defenses are so strong, they have put together that whole, belief that I'm strong and I've survived, and that's what's helping them. So how do you rip those defenses down and just, tell them to then carry on with life? So we just go with where the client is in the present, and if they don't want to approach the memories of trauma, then we don't approach it till they are ready. And as I said, the brain itself is so beautiful that it will go to those unhealed places. Sometimes in the middle of an EMDR session, we are working with something completely innocuous, nothing to do with their sexual life. We may be working with, say, a manager's criticism. Okay. But it goes back to something related to a trauma. And then they, say they report that I don't know why these pictures are flashing in my mind, or why am I suddenly thinking of that memory? I think it's gone. So I always tell them that your brain knows best, and your brain has hold and stored material, and we just go from wherever your brain is giving us the signal. And that's when they begin to learn to trust themselves. Because if I, as a therapist, are going to tell them that your current pathology is because of the past and that is what you need to work with, who will buy it and who will believe it? They have to trust themselves. So, in the space of therapy, my goal is to offer them psychoeducation, safety, compassion, caring, and to let them go where they are going. That said, I have also seen a section of people who have never approached sexual abuse memories in the past, and they are still healed. They are fine. They look at those memories and they truly feel that they have gone over them, they have worked with them. I have in my own, not a very big, uh, I would say, number of such people, but there are some who really, without working with the memory itself, still seem to heal and still seem to work around it. Everybody's brain is different. All I'll say is that for my message to adult survivors of abuse would be that don't just look at the impact of a sexual act on your sexual life. That's a very big linear connection a lot of people make. But it's not like that. The tentacles, as I said, spread into so many areas: your confidence, your ability to relate to another person, your trust, as Sonal said, your ability to even trust yourself, your ability to experience happiness and be okay with experiencing happiness may all be tied into those experiences of the past which have not been healed. So I would say that give yourself a chance and approach a therapist or approach an institute and try and get the help that you can get. Today, India has advanced much more than it was when I began my practice 18, 20 years ago. It's no more, considered like, oh, sexual abuse doesn't happen to so many people. Oh, थोड़े थोड़े वो वहाँ के, वो slums के बच्चों के साथ ही होता है, that kind of a thing. It's no more that. We know that it's there all across in our society. The numbers in India are startling. Many of us have gone through these experiences and have chosen to keep quiet about them. So don't be in that larger population. Seek the help, speak out, help others. So I would just say that adult survivors have a lot to offer themselves and, of course, others as well if they overcome these experiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abhay. We'll now start taking questions from the audience. Let me just see if the question has come up. Yes. The question is sexual abuse is personal and confidential when it comes to family. The shame and stigma is much more than clinical depression to the child. The family outcasts the child for life because of the incident. The mentality in India is way narrow than we think. How do we bridge the gap between parents and the child? The parents sometimes are not willing to listen or consider a psychologist. If the panelists could throw some light, would be great. Thank you. Okay, Habubi, would you like to respond to this question?
I think that's like hit the nail on the head. If you ask me what is the biggest challenge, then apart from reporting, of course, for most of us working with cases of child sexual abuse, it's the unwillingness of the family members to believe it's happening. You can put a lot of evidence in front, and why would you even need evidence? If the child is saying it, that's evidence enough. You don't need to have tape recorded proof of these incidents, but families refuse to listen. And I can tell you, it creates a lot of stress for me, being a private practitioner and being the only person who may have listened to the child so far and listened deep enough to understand something like this was happening. As I said, there are only a few cases that come directly with the, with approaching with an incident of child sexual abuse. It's more or less revealed during the course of therapy. So what I do is, if I've established a connection with the child so far, I look for not just the parents, because frankly speaking, Sonal has said it, Namrata has said it. We don't always look at the people living with the child and who are, feeding and clothing the child as the only ones who'd be concerned about their mental health or their health. So we look for a wider support system. I always look for a caring teacher that I could speak to, or a doctor I can speak to, somebody whose help I can enlist to get across this thing to the parents. If possible, then I will go to their clinic, and together we can approach the parent without the child being present. Sometimes I will call the parent in and have another person also present with me, so that we can say that it is backed up by a medical examination, or I will have the teacher on call. I've tried various methods, but I can say that I'm not always successful. Parents often want to just do this and behave like it's not happening. So what I do is I continue, I persist. Can we find somebody else in the environment? Because we need to keep the child safe. We need to make sure that the child is getting what he or she deserves. Um, sometimes there is success, okay, where a parent is willing to believe that somebody in the family has done it, whether it is a cousin or whether it is an uncle or whether it's the grandparents, sometimes a father who may have sexually abused the child, and then there is strength and they leave the house or they push the perpetrator out of the house. But let's be honest, all of us working in this platform, how many times do we see that happen? Possibly very rarely. But we have to still persist. Our goal is not, for me, I have learned through these 20 years, my goal is not convincing the parent. My goal is making the child safe. How do I make the child safe has to be the primary goal, whether the parent is convinced or not. Enlisting the help of the parent is the best, but what are the other sources of help that I can get from many other areas? Sometimes we relocated the child to a grandparent's home despite the lack of consent from the parent. Sometimes I have worked extensively with the parent till their mind accepts that this thing is happening. Sometimes we have a negotiation happen, in the sense that, let's not say that okay, this person is a perpetrator, but let's make sure the child is not meeting that person, or let's give them a break from this person for a certain amount of time, and then see if the child is feeling better, safer, is bouncing back to normalcy. So we negotiate something. But I would say that this is not an easy area. It never has been, and I don't suppose it will ever be. But we still have to keep trying. As in this area of work that we do, we cannot expect this to be the most straightforward area. That's
Thank
what
you,
I would say.
Havabi. Yeah, thank you so much. Now, this is a question for Sonal. How do you deep work and scale work together, especially in the context of healing?
Okay, I think that's a great question. I can't see the questions. I don't know who's asked, but thank you. I think when you're looking at the depth of scale and the number line of scale, as if I can dare call it, we have to understand. So, for example, in Protsahan's case, now when we started, we didn't do any preventive work for the first 6 years. We were only doing healing work, right? Of course, the definitions, the terminologies, the recovery from trauma, all of these definitions came in probably 6 7 years into our work, right? And how could we understand that in the context of our work for extremely marginalized children who could never have the money or the means to explore or kind of undergo therapy of any kind. And one of the core things that we have understood is that if you do deep work, you will get a lot of insights And it's not incumbent upon one Arpan or one Protsahan or one Enfold or one Tulir or one Haq or one Leher or some beautiful organizations that are doing beautiful work, in this entire space, not just CSA, but the entire child rights space. And it's important to understand that, our deep work will lead us with insights, right? And those insights are scalable. So, for example, if the last 11 years of our work has given us like this plethora of insights, what we do is we are trying to kind of put that in a system where we share it with the Delhi government, right? We're putting that in a system where we work with probably 35 government schools as a pilot, where we are trying to put those insights together. And it's not just one Arpan or one Protsahan that can really fight and, win against this battle. It will need thousands and thousands of such organizations or more, right, which need to come together and use those insights in one little area of Chennai, one little area of Bengal, one little area of Rajasthan, right? And that's how scale happens. Because let's also understand, when you're looking at trauma, right? I think Habubi also touched upon this, just a while back, that when you're looking at, if you try to change the families, we're trying to change the parents, or, how do we make them a part of the entire healing journey? Sometimes it will be possible. Most of the times it's not going to work, because trauma at its core affects the person's capacity to be self compassionate, and trauma recovery means nurturing and growing that capacity and ability to be, self compassionate, to kind of direct the kindness at yourself. And I think this needs just more empathetic people, young, old, whatsoever, but more empathetic people to start working with children. Scale could also mean, getting a set of 10 amazing volunteers with some basic orientation, kind of thrown in, and say, hey, can you spend 2 hours of talking time with the child? Of course, with a lot of orientation thrown in, right? And choosing the right empathetic individuals as these 10 volunteers, for example. So scale can be in any capacity. I think if you're working with 10 children, that's scale, because that's 10 children, deep work with 10 children. If you're working in terms of, let's say, working with 2 classrooms or 5 schools, that is scale as well, in my understanding, because wahan pe preventive work of what is a safe touch, what is an unsafe touch, who do you report to as 10, 9, 8, child line, etc. All of this encompasses, the kind of messaging that we want to throw to our children, right? And sometimes I do see that, in preventive work, what happens is that, with a lot of good intentions, the safe, unsafe touch, etc., or this was the wrong thing that happened, this was the right thing, etc., is given to the children. But 2 children out of that set of 60 or 50 children will come, 2 or 3 kids will come and say, hey, but mere saath to ye hua hai. And the trainer would not know how to handle that disclosure. So I think when we are looking at scale, let's not look at empty scale. When we are looking at scale, even scale needs to be holistic, because we're looking at healing, which is holistic. The scale of reaching out with these interventions has to be holistic as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Uh, we'll just take one more small question. What are the ways to go in therapeutic settings if parents of the child undergoing CSA are not cooperative? Is there any way to go then? Namrata, would you like to respond? What can be done?
I think this is one of the common challenges that one can come across while working with the case of child sexual abuse. In a lot of cases, what we do is we educate the parents in terms of what is child sexual abuse, because most of the times they are unaware of how it happens, and the way grooming plays an important role in the whole child sexual abuse. The way a perpetrator can groom not just the child but a certain family member in a way that it would be a disbelief if the child goes and reports about it to somebody. So therefore, educating them about grooming, about what child sexual abuse is, about certain behavioral aspects of the child that requires attention, as a part to explain them that this is the impact of the trauma that this person or the child has been through. I think most of the time that sensitization is required with a lot of compassion, because in a lot of ways the resistance from parents also come from a lot of personal barriers in that case. So giving them that space, that hearing space, being compassionate towards them, as well as navigating their empathy that the child requires in the healing journey and their role. Most of the times the parents feel that पढ़ाई में अच्छा कर रहा है, but सबसे बात अच्छे से कर रहा है, तो इसको तो कोई problem नहीं है. But telling them that how a scar or a trauma is beyond that, and that requires attention. Most of the times we try and use the metaphor of a physical pain, just like how you have a pain in a specific area and you go and see the doctor. It's important that certain instances in our lives will leave a scar on the child. It may not lead to pain, but it's an internal injury that needs to be worked upon. And if ignored, what happens? So giving them education and awareness around that is something that has to be in priority. I feel.
If I can just add
Okay.
on
Yes.
one quick little,
Yes.
when parents etc. are not looking at or understanding the complexity of things. Now, when you're looking at child sexual abuse, I think in the beginning you mentioned, Anupriya, that it's a very controversial space when it comes to reporting. Right now, you as a good Samaritan might want to report a neighbor's child who's being violated sexually, physically, etc. You don't know, but you are sure something is a problem. And as a neighbor who stayed for 5, 10, 15 years next door to those guys, you know that raat ko bahut awaaz aati hai, or some little evidence you have. For example, I'm just giving a very hypothetical case, and you want to help the child. But POXO is an area that we need to understand. This is again, a lot of us organizations are now trying to work with the governments, state, central, whatever, and trying to talk about this mandatory reporting bit, right? Kitna zaruri hai, kitna nahi hai, how do we get the consent of people who even wish to report or not, or want to solve it at a community or a family level, right? Then what does, because justice in India, let's be, and I am politically incorrect, so I will not mince words, but I think if you kind of report something, it will take you 10, 15, 20 years for getting justice for that little child who's been violated, right? And sometimes older people say, just report the thing, send the child to an institutionalization space or an institution. I think institutionalization should be the last resort, because wahan pe, for example, a lot of incest cases that we deal with, in the beginning are, the first thing that we thought was, hey, the perpetrator should be removed. But when we started speaking to different organizations, they said, oh, the child should be institutionalized. We said, why it's not the child's fault. She'll end up losing the relationship or the bond with her mother, with her sisters, her siblings, her friends in the area, her school. That will go for a toss if she's institutionalized. The perpetrator needs to be probably institutionalized, or we need to look at other reformative ways of getting a solution set to this. Again, reformative practices, as easy as it may sound, they are very, very complex. They definitely work in the context and the settings that we have seen, but again, it's a long drawn process, right? And we need to understand, healing is also a lot about justice, right? Healing is a lot to do with the consent of how my justice should be served to me. Healing is a lot to do with peace, how much peace or a safe space that I can find myself in as a child, right? Because peace cannot exist without true justice, and vice versa, right? And true justice would need compassion, would not need and that compassion needs to be kind of set up at a systems level, and is something that we are now trying to figure out at Protsahan.
Thank you so much. There are way more questions coming up, but because of lack of time, we will email you the responses. Now, before we close, I would like our esteemed panelists to give us a takeaway message. Starting with Havovi, if you have something for the audience as a takeaway.
So the takeaway I would have is, like I said, for the adult survivors of abuse, look to heal yourselves and reach out for help. I know that it's not always easy, and sometimes there may be bad experiences in that journey, even with the healer that you may meet, but continue with that. A message that I would give all parents is trust your child. If they say something like this, you don't need evidence. The child is evidence enough. So I can't repeat it over and over and over, but I would say it a million times that if your child says it, don't look beyond, just trust. Yeah. Of course, you need to be able to handle the situation with a lot more, with a lot of delicacy, especially if you're living in more complex ecosystems like a joint family. But a child and their future and their health has to be put above everything else. So that would be my appeal to all the parents out there.
Thank you, Vibhuti. Sonal?
I think we're still getting used to the mute unmute buttons here. I think focusing, if there's a one takeaway that I would want all, the listeners and the people who are joining in today to take away is that, when you focus on strengths instead of weaknesses, that's the basic tenet of recovery from trauma, right? And when you talk about these strengths, we have to be very, very careful that it needs a lot of empathy and love, no matter how corny it may sound at a systems level, because empathy and hope and love and all of that compassion can be built in a systems level. Whether you like it or not, it has to be built at a systems level if we are to take care of our children. Because there's this thing that I love, this quote that says that love a child so much that she starts loving herself. Love a child so much that he or they start loving themselves. And I think that's the core message when you're talking about recovery from trauma, that you love somebody so much, when you focus on their strengths, when you tell them, I trust you, I believe you, you were not at fault. I think when you constantly hammer these messages, we can get a child on a path to healing. Not completely healed, the journey can begin right away.
Namrata?
I think with the impact that trauma leaves on people, sometimes they are not able to see beyond it. I just want to tell people this small message that healing is possible at any stage, at any age. There is no right age to seek help or to seek therapy. Um, it just makes you more aware about yourself. It maximizes your potential and it creates a sense of resilience in people to, in general, cope with life in a lot of ways.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Those were great insights to take home. Thank you so much, esteemed panelists. It was such a great time, such a great enlightening session. Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you. Thank you.